Remind us exactly of what the Supreme Court has ruled, and then tell us what you think the Trump response to this will be if we've missed it.
Oh, let me give you the takeaway, Matt, and then talk to you about three cases, including the latest. The takeaway is that we are on the verge, for the first time in my lifetime, and I actually think in U.S. history, of an authoritarian regime. And by that I mean an executive branch that does not recognize the authority of the judiciary and is trying to break other U.S. institutions, whether we're talking about the media, whether we're talking about universities, U.S. agencies. Now, where do those cases fit into this? The Supreme Court's latest ruling has said temporarily you must not deport, in effect, disappear migrants into foreign prisons, especially in El Salvador. It stems from a Texas case where about 60 Venezuelans were about to be sent to El Salvador. Now, the Supreme Court did not say, they didn't rule on the merits of the deportations themselves. They sent it back to a federal appeals court and said the federal appeals court will rule whether the Trump administration can use a 1798 law called the Alien Enemies Act to carry out these deportations. But until the federal appeals court rules, no deportations.
Right.
There are two other cases, though, that are important that intersect with this, Matt. The second is also a Supreme Court ruling, which the Trump administration is already defying. They ruled 9-0 in the case of an El Salvador national and a legal U.S. resident, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, that he should not have been sent to El Salvador and he should be returned. The Trump administration is defying that order. They're doubling down and saying that Garcia will never be returned to Maryland, where his wife and children are. And then the third case is a federal district court judge, but it's an important one, Judge James Boasberg, who has said that the deportees should come back from El Salvador, that the Trump administration has defied his order that they should come back, and that they have probably put themselves in the position of criminal contempt of court. And if they do not respond to that, then he will pursue criminal charges against Trump administration officials in the near future.
This is really interesting. So there are three legal challenges there, two from the Supreme Court, one from this other judge, an appeals court. And yet, on the question of the Venezuelan citizen who's been sent, but with legal, papers in the US, who's been sent to that supermax jail in El Salvador, it was the El Salvadorian president, Bukele, who in the Oval Office said to Trump, I can't possibly send this guy back to you. That's like sending you a terrorist, even though there's absolutely no proof that this man has any connection to any terrorist or violent gang. So, and Trump basically said, yeah, thanks very much. So Trump is siding with a foreign dictator, because that's what Bukele is, more than he is with his own Supreme Court.
Well, Trump's officials are using Bukele, who is an authoritarian, as cover. You see, if they say, we're not going to return Garcia, right? The courts are going to say, look, it is your jurisdiction. You sent him away. You've got to get it back. They just hand off to Bukele and say, oh, no, it's up to the El Salvador government to send it back, right? Now, you're absolutely right that Bukele lies that Garcia is a terrorist. There's no evidence presented to that. But on top of that Bukele announcement in the Oval Office, the Trump administration officials then put in more lies. They said, for example, that Garcia is a wife beater. That's a lie. They said that he has a criminal record. No evidence presented for that. They said that he's a member of MS-13, an El Salvador gang. No evidence presented. But they have not only lied in the case of Garcia. Go back to the Venezuelans, where there have been more than 230 who have been disappeared. There has been no evidence produced that they're members of this gang called Tren de Aragua. There's no evidence, in fact, that they've even committed crimes in the United States, because the Trump administration has not even given us their names. And they have erased them from the database of undocumented migrants.
What they have given us are pictures of these deportees with their heads shaven and lots of tattoos, sent on a plane to El Salvador. But if you're deporting people on the basis of tattoos, I would say to David Beckham, never ever go to the United States, because he's on slippy territory there. But I think the serious point here is the Supreme Court is saying we are a rules-based nation. That is what has made America great. You need to follow due process. And if we decide that, if the courts discover that these people are indeed members of violent gangs and they don't have legal rights to stay in the US, then by all means deport them. But you can't just spirit them away in the middle of the night.
If this had happened in other countries, Matt, if it had happened in Russia or in North Korea or in Syria or in Iran, I've covered all those countries, we would come out and say that these are authoritarian systems that are committing human rights abuses. When this happened in the United States more than 20 years ago, not to legal immigrants, but to foreign nationals, when they were sent to Guantanamo Bay and disappeared for years, that was rightly criticized. Now you have an administration that says not only can migrants be sent to El Salvador, Donald Trump says U.S. citizens can be sent to this. That's how far we've gotten with an administration led by a convicted felon, interestingly enough.
Which, by the way, no one mentions anymore in the U.S. especially. I mean, he is a convicted felon. We can't say this often enough.
Yeah, it is, because, Matt, and I know what authoritarian means, and I did not start using that word until a week ago. But what does an authoritarian regime do? If we look at other countries, they try to defy the judicial system. They try to break the media, where the media does not report independently on what is occurring. They try to break the universities, where universities are not independent, which we're seeing happen with Harvard and other universities. They try to break government agencies, where they only have loyalists in those agencies, which we've seen Elon Musk try to do. And they try to create an alternative narrative where that idea of checks and balances, that idea of rule and law, the very idea of the U.S. Constitution is put to the side. It's only their interpretation, or rather their distortion, which is held up before us.
Right. If Donald Trump turns around to the Supreme Court after their latest ruling and says, so what? How serious is that?
It's the biggest crisis in U.S. domestic politics since 1865.
Yeah.
That was the end of the Civil War,
right,
where you had a number of states who defied federal authority, said, we're not going to recognize federal courts, we're not going to recognize the presidency. That was a 4-year war. Now, 160 years later, we have a president and a group of his advisors who in Washington, rather than in the American South, are saying, we don't recognize the American system as it's constructed. That's where we have gotten to.
It's one of the reasons why this is tricky and why people aren't calling it out as much as you and an increasing number of academics and journalists are, and actually a few Democrats as well, is that there's something about Donald Trump, that is so ridiculous, the orange man, the tangerine man, that actually his sort of vaudeville appearance takes some of the seriousness out of the actual issue. And the fact that he's flighty and, all over the shop himself. So Joe Klein, the journalist, former Time magazine journalist, once told me, we'll be laughing all the way to Armageddon with this guy in charge.
Yeah, I think there's something in that, Matt, in terms of that American politics has always had a lot of spectacle about it. And H.L. Mencken a century ago talked about it basically a circus with a ringmaster. And what has happened is not just American media, but many international media, not yourselves, have just been led by the spectacle. Trump's latest tweet, Trump's latest tantrum. And they haven't gotten back to the basics of the facts and the issues that are taking place, because now this is out in the open. In Trump 1.0, he kind of hid behind the spectacle. He wasn't as blatant in terms of what he's trying to do. Now you cannot say that he is not being serious and upfront about what he wants to achieve.
Finally, and very briefly, if you don't mind, is one of America's problems here its own sense of exceptionalism. We are the greatest democracy on earth. This is the mantra we've heard for decades. Not everyone believes that, of course. But if you think that you're somehow exceptional, you don't think that you can go down the slippery slope that so many European countries have gone down in the last century.
I think part of it is exceptional, but part of it is that Americans have forgotten what might make that country great. What makes America great again is not a man who wears a red hat and shouts that he's above the law. It's the idea of whether or not America's lived up to this in the past, that you have a system which for 250 years has said equality, justice, and due process.
And I will end where I started this morning. Isn't it ironic that in the 250th anniversary of the revolution against the British crown, we have a man in the White House who not only loves a sleepover with the crown today, but actually might want to wear one himself.
All hail King Donald.